Welcome to the Lancaster Patriot Podcast. My name is Chris Hume, the managing editor of the Lancaster Patriot, and I'm joined today by three guests. To my left, I have Dave Stoltzfus, CEO of the Lancaster Patriot. Dave, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
To my far right, I have Joel Saint, pastor of Independence Reformed Bible Church and executive director of the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us again, Joel. And to my immediate right, Luke Saint, the chairman of the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society and author of the Sound Doctrine of Theocracy. Luke, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
Yep, thanks for coming back. All right, well, we want to respond to a Rolling Stone article that was published this past weekend, and we want to engage that and interact a little bit with it. So let's start off here with the title of this article, Luke, and I want to give the first word to you in response to this article. So this article came out, I think, Saturday by Rolling Stone by Tim Dickinson, and it was in response to a podcast you and I did, which was about your book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy. And the title of this article is, "These Christian Nationalists Want to Stone Adulterers to Death." So Luke, what's your first response, and what did you think when you saw that title?
After reading the article, some people have called it a hit piece, but it's actually, in my opinion, more like a slap piece. It's not that bad. I mean, because he quoted us in context, and if you read through the article, I'm reading the stuff that he quoted us saying, and I'm like, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, it's not like he really took us out of context. The only thing that was really out of context was the title of the article, "These Christian Nationalists Want to Stone Adulterers to Death." And as you pointed out in your podcast yesterday, which was a really good podcast, said most of the things that I wanted to say. It says, "These Christian Nationalists want to stone adulterers to death," but then a couple paragraphs in, it says, "Nobody wants to do it, and that's the way it's supposed to be."
Quoting you.
Yeah, quoting me, and that's what I said. And it's not confusing to me. It's dishonest to say, well, everyone, these guys want to stone adulterers to death, and then quote me saying, both of us really saying it's appropriately barbaric and nobody wants to do it. And that's the beauty of it, is that nobody wants to do it. That stoning requires incredible conviction, something that our justice system does not require today. Our justice system does not require conviction to put somebody to death. Prosecutors don't really need a conviction when they send someone away for life and separate them from their families. They don't need a conviction. All they need really is a desire to further their career. And, they don't have to deal with the consequences of their decisions. Juries, too, when they convict somebody, they don't really have to deal with the consequences of their decisions. I understand it's still not easy, but they can go home and they don't have to see the person that they put away for the rest of their life again. I mean, the Bible makes a claim that the mercy of the wicked is cruel. One thing in the article is Saint did not respond for a request for an interview. Still waiting for that request for the interview. I went through all my channels and I was like, where did I get this request? I checked my email, checked my spam, and then in a couple of days, I started telling everyone, I didn't get a request. And then I was like, well, what about my Instagram? And I went to my Instagram and there was a message there, and I was like, oh, there it is. But actually, it was just my wife sending me recipes. So never got the request for an interview. And I don't know what to make of that. Is that a thing in journalism where we just say, I requested, but he didn't say anything back, So, a lot of the things that I wanted to say about stoning, he put in there. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for the article. Somebody made a comment that, in the podcast that the book only has, 1 5-star review, and that's done by you, Chris. And, they're pointing that out. And, I chuckled to myself. I said, that's true, but just look at what this one podcast and this one little book is doing. It's triggering all these people. And friends, if you don't want this idea, if you don't want these ideas to get out, then you better just leave us alone. You better not talk about us. You better not comment nasty things. You better just leave us alone, because the more attention you give us, the more this idea is going to get out there. And that's ultimately what we want. We want the Christian community to interact with the law of God. We want them to interact with, okay, is God's law just or is it unjust? And I want to read a verse here from Isaiah 42:21. It says, "The Lord was pleased for his righteousness' sake to magnify his law and make it glorious." If you want to know my attitude, and I think the attitude of the people in this room, if you want to know our attitude towards God's law, that's what it is. We magnify God's law because it is glorious. And that's not something that we designated for ourselves. It says right here in the Bible, God's law is glorious. And Christ rising from the dead doesn't change that fact. It changes certain aspects of the law, the ceremonial aspect, but doesn't mean that somehow the law becomes unjust now in its application. The law is never good for our justification. We can never be justified by the law. We say that all the time, and that's where the Christian community is very confused, because pastors won't talk about this. They won't address these things from the pulpit. They won't talk about it. They're too scared. But the confusion comes in when we read Galatians, and it looks like Paul's trashing the law, and people quote that all the time. But this podcast is ultimately going to be a defense of theonomy. And when we read things like Galatians, we're like, oh, see, the law is no longer applicable. No, the law is not good for our justification, but it still applies. It's good for application. In Romans it says we uphold the law. The law is good if it's used lawfully in 1 Timothy. So this podcast is ultimately going to be a defense of theonomy, and my book is ultimately a defense of theocracy.
That's good. Thank you, Luke. Now, Joel, I want to bring you in here. I'm trying to think through here what the main objection is to Luke's book and the podcast. Obviously, stoning is the thing that is put up in front in this article, in the title, and that's kind of the thing that's meant to grab the attention of everyone. These crazy Christians believe in something that God instituted. But let's take it back a step and talk about just executions and capital punishment. Because, that really wasn't addressed. It's almost like that's the issue here, that we believe in capital punishment or executions. And that was not addressed in the article. And there was a lot of things I think that were fair, but there was also definitely a slant here, which is to be expected from Rolling Stone, trying to make us look crazy because we believe in capital punishment. So what are your thoughts on that, Joel? And what was your reaction when you saw this article?
Yeah. I want to talk. Yeah, let's talk about capital punishment for a moment here. Everyone believes in capital punishment, even those people outside of a jail someplace, like don't put this murderer to death or whatever. They all believe in capital punishment. We believe in capital punishment for at least 60 million babies for the crime of existing. Yep. Note that they exist. Therefore, they need to be capitally punished. Mm-hmm. What intrigued me about this article, this particular article, was that it seemed as if Dickinson, the author, was more outraged at the idea that adultery is a crime than he was with the idea of execution for it. Like who are these crazy people that believe that adultery is a crime? Well, here's the thing for you, Tim Dickinson. If there's no such thing as adultery, then there's no such thing as marriage. And so the people saying that they're, like us, who've been saying for years that these pagan people, these secularists are out to destroy marriage, we are correct. Because if you don't have adultery, then you don't have marriage. Think about it. Adultery is not a crime. A person just rolls out of bed. Yeah, I made those vows and so forth to honor and so forth and stay with this person. But today I don't feel like it. Okay, well, if that's a legitimate thing to do, then what is marriage to begin with? I'll tell you, Chris, that was the thing that kind of impressed me more about this article than anything. Almost like this shock, like adultery is a crime? Who ever heard of such a thing? Well, I would say, forever, O Lord, your word is settled in heaven. So adultery's been a crime from the very beginning, and it will be a crime long after we're all dead. And whether or not the state recognizes it as a crime is immaterial. God says it's a crime.
Well, it's interesting, too, because, in the article he says the non-crime of adultery. And when I responded to him, I didn't think about it at the time, but there are several states in the United States of America that adultery is a crime. So that kind of reveals, and there was so much of that in response to this the podcast, the original podcast with Luke. People say, oh, this is crazy. You guys are totally at odds with American history. We're not even, as far as adultery being a crime, we're not even at odds with the current American legal system. And I think it's about 15, 16 states, adultery is a crime. So the fact that, Tim Dickinson is just shocked and saying that the non-crime of adultery, in a lot of states, it no longer is a crime, but currently in some states it is, which points to the fact that in every state, I believe it once was, in America, and all the original, and William Penn, even Pennsylvania, and this, we might get into this, the idea of religious toleration. William Penn, who was all about religious freedom within Christendom, he outlawed adultery. He outlawed sodomy. So that kind of just reveals that the brainwashing, shall I say, of the statist mind that, adultery is not a crime anywhere. How could you even suggest such a thing? But it is a crime. Now, it's not prosecuted very much, and certainly not according to the penalty the Bible prescribes. Could be, not in every case, but it still is a crime in some states. So we might get into that more. Dave, I want to bring you in here. Your initial reaction to this, seeing the Lancaster Patriot on here on the Rolling Stone. These Christian nationalists want to stone adulterers to death, and what's your initial reaction to this?
I mean, I think my initial reaction was the same as almost everyone's here. It's implying that we are lining them up. You know, we're out there looking for them. We're marching down to the square and trying to find them. And I think what people have to understand is that even to stone someone under biblical law, you have to have witnesses. You have to have 2 or 3 witnesses. Mm-hmm. You know, they don't even know what they're talking about at the end of the day, because they're like, oh yeah, you're going to go down to the town square, you're going to find a couple adulterers, you're going to stone them to death. No, like, it doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. That's anarchy. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know anyone who holds our position who is in favor of an anarchy view. Mm-hmm.
Right.
So at the end of the day, what they're really just, I think they're trying to portray something onto us that,
well, they're doing what most Christians do when it comes to the law of God. And you talk about theonomy, they're airlifting their statism into the Bible, or vice versa. They're airlifting the Bible into their statism, and they're thinking about the law of God in statist terms. And you know, we think about it, you know, because we have this idea that justice is blind, and I believe that is correct. However, justice is not cruel, and so we airlift the scriptures into our statist mindset in the same way that, you know, when an officer sees someone speeding, he has an obligation to enforce the law no matter what. He has to enforce the law. And we do that the same way when we look at biblical jurisprudence, which we don't understand. We don't understand 2 or 3 witnesses. We don't understand the hands of the witness must be first against them. We don't understand that the Bible commands us to do justly and love mercy at the same time. And the biblical system, theonomy and theocracy, is the only biblical system that you can do justly and love mercy at the same time. In our statist situation we have right now, to do justly is to withhold mercy, and to show mercy is to withhold justice. We can't do them both at the same time. If you look at the Gospels, Joseph had the option to prosecute his wife because, you know, she was found with child, and Joseph's like, well, it's not me. You know, I know it wasn't me. And it says he, being a just man, decided to divorce her quietly. So Joseph did justly and loved mercy at the same time. It wasn't like, oh, grab her and stone her to death. You know, I'm supposed to, right? Now, that's so the victims. See, the theonomy ultimately gives power to the victims for prosecution. And that's what we don't have today. The victims, as you've seen in our justice system, I remember, what was the name of that horrible person who was abusing those Olympic gymnasts?
Oh yeah, the dude. I think he actually died in jail.
Oh, did he?
I'm not sure. Maybe think about some of, but I mean, you said who's that horrible person? I'm like, well, millions of people here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but if you look at the trials, the father, one of the fathers, requested the judge, "Can I please have 2 minutes alone with this guy?" And then the judge said no, and then the guy tried to run through the court and rip this guy to shreds with his bare hands. Now, I mean, Tim, are you going to say that if this man ripped that pedophile to death with his own bare hands, are you going to say that's unjust? So I hope you don't. I mean, because that's really messed up. That's the unjust part. The mercy of the wicked is cruel.
I think Tim would say it's unjust because it appears
Absolutely.
as if Rolling Stone, loved cuties. Apparently,
that's true.
You know, and hates the sound of freedom.
Right.
So he might say that justice is allow the pedophiles to go free.
Right. Well,
he may.
Yeah, the point I'm saying is that theonomy and theocracy give power to the victim to see justice all the way through. In our system, the victims of of things like that happened in that case, they were not given justice. So it's sent to prison. That's not justice. That's not justice.
Well, I mean,
the mercy of the wicked is cruel.
Prison is actually cruel.
Yes.
Like nowadays, you have PETA out there complaining about putting animals, and I don't want to go down a rabbit trail, but we have PETA complaining about animals in cages, and yet we put people in cages for life.
It's true.
People made in the image of God. Come on.
Yeah.
What type of society does that to their own people?
A wicked one.
Now let's a little bit more on executions here. One of the comments on the podcast on YouTube, Luke, was your initial podcast with me was, doesn't this violate the terms of service for YouTube because you're calling for people to be put to death? Which was funny. I responded like abortion, where every all these people promoting abortion. So talking about what crimes should be capital offenses in society is not calling on people to go out and kill people.
No,
it's saying what is the standard of justice that we are going to have in our nation.
Right.
And so there was just some hypocrisy, and there's a lot of hypocrisy here. Just the reaction against, you think that there are some cases where adulterers could be executed. Well, yes, but as you mentioned, Joel, you think that babies can be executed behind closed doors of Planned Parenthood without a trial. Now, we can talk about that. Luke, I also want to talk about how executions are carried out today. They're few and far between, but they do still happen. And when they happen, the person that is executing said criminal might know nothing about this person.
Exactly.
Might know nothing about the case, might have no conviction whatsoever that this person deserves to be executed, and yet still kills him.
Yeah.
What do you say to that? And are there dangers there with that type of system where you have people who are, I'm just following orders. I was told to kill this guy. I have no idea why, but I'm going to do it.
Right. What was that book that came out a while ago called, I think it's called Ordinary Men. It talked about how the statists of the Nazis and the communists were able to turn men who had families and were just normal, nice guys into murderers in a matter of weeks or months, just by calmly telling them, well, they basically removed the status of value to a whole class of people, removed their value and said they're not even human beings, so go off and kill them. I remember hearing about those poor people who were put on death row, and then they found out that they were innocent later and they were taken off death row, but they had to live for 20, 30, sometimes 10, 5 years, dreading being put to death. And these kind of things happen because the accuser doesn't have to see it all the way through. When you have somebody who automatically takes over and says, well, I'm just doing my job. I have no dog in the race. Justice is blind, right? So I have no dog in the race. I was told to, it's my 9 to 5. I'm just told to kill you. I'm just doing my job. Hey, I didn't accuse you, whatever. The danger there is that people who have no, like I said before, people who have no dog in the race, people who have no conviction. I think every time someone is put to death justly, it requires incredible conviction by the person doing it. Right now, we don't need conviction. I accuse you and then I hand you off to the state. The state does the rest. The hotshot lawyer comes in who's trying to get some wins under his belt. He comes in, he prosecutes, he accuses, but he doesn't have to see it through. So we're like sometimes you're like 4 or 5 or 6 people into it who have not witnessed it and who have no conviction either way. Maybe he's innocent. I don't know. I'm just doing my job. And they're all interacting with this potential victim, or maybe he's guilty. Maybe he is guilty, but they can afford to not care at the end of the day because our judicial system affords people the ability to not have conviction about the innocence or the guilt of this person and still put them to death.
I'd also like to add on the accuser's part. Under biblical law, the accuser, if someone is accusing someone unjustly, care to comment on that? Because at the end of the day, we still have perjury in the United States.
Yes, we do.
But it's rarely held up.
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. The perjury of the scriptures is incredibly it's incredibly important because a lot of times in our society, there are many. I think this is a phenomenon, but there are many men who are accused of rape. of raping their girlfriends or raping a woman, and then it's found a lot of times, not always, but it's a lot of times it's found out that they never did it. Well, their lives are ruined, their life is over, but the women, they carry on like nothing happened. Nothing happens to them, but in a biblical system, if you accuse somebody of rape or murder, and it turns out that you're lying, you are now guilty of the crime that you accuse them of, right?
Or
And
the penalty of
the penalty, yes, right.
It might not always be capital punishment, but it might be restitution or something like that.
But
right?
again, we have to be careful about airlifting our statism on it, because again, people are thinking, well, I guess I'd better. Okay, so once I find out that somebody is guilty of perjury, then I have to automatically go and kill them. No, this requires another trial where the accuser is saying they committed perjury, 2 or 3 witnesses of perjury, and then those people who accuse of perjury have to be the ones to throw the first stones again, right? So it goes back to the accusers always have to see it through, because they're the only ones who have conviction that's necessary to carry it out. And again, like I said before, this is a high maintenance event. A lot of things need to come into play, and that's what makes it so. I think that's what makes it so effective, and that's why God instituted, because it just makes it difficult to kill people. It's just so difficult. You need a lot of things to come into play.
I was gonna mention that. I mean, even to have 2 or 3 witnesses in an adultery case,
Yeah.
well, what are the chances of that?
Yeah, right. Almost
what
none.
What are the chances
Right,
of that?
right. And again,
Or sodomy. We used to say, just keep it in the closet.
right.
I mean, there was a reason for that, right?
Right. But even there with adultery, so, it says a man shall not lie with another man's wife, right? So if you see some guy hanging out with another guy's wife, does that mean that's enough evidence to convict them of adultery? Well, no, because you're just seeing them together, But again, we lift our statism. Oh, you crossed this line, so I got to take you and destroy you. Again, you have to actually see the act. You have to have 2 or 3 witnesses of the act. So the most of the battles that the state is fighting belong to the family, and they belong to the church. We've taken a lot of the battles that the church should be fighting and the family should be fighting, and we've given them to the state and said, here, you just automatically do it, so we don't have to. We want a king to go out and fight our wars for us. This is, again, the same argument that the Israelites had. We want to get rid of the responsibility. We're tired of enforcing justice ourselves. We want the king to go and do it for us. We don't want to do it anymore. And that's a huge problem of the American jurisprudence.
Joel, anything you want to add to that?
I want to go back to something I'd like to add to that, but just this Rolling Stone thing. Please know this. The Rolling Stone came out against this podcast and this book. Here's what they had to say about cuties in their heading. Thanks to a major marketing mistake, I doubt that, but okay, a major marketing mistake. This award-winning French movie has been accused of sexualizing girls. It's actually a sensitive portrait of growing pains that deserves to be seen. So this movie that glorifies pedophilia, quite frankly, and sexualizes young girls, Rolling Stone magazine is praising while trashing this book. So make sure you put that through your mind when you consider what they're saying.
That's lost in translation, Joel.
Nobody cares.
Nobody cares about that.
Who cares? Yeah, these same people that hate this book that obviously points out that adultery is a crime. Well, they believe, apparently, from what they're saying, they're not going to say it explicitly yet, but from what their demonstrable actions are, believe that pedophilia, or at least young girls sexualizing themselves, that's not a crime.
They're at least advocating for it.
Yeah, there's no question about it.
They're not talking bad about it, so they are advocating for it.
And one other thing too, this is from a book, God is Just, by Stephen Halbrook. He makes this point about stoning. He says, while some may understand biblical stoning to be an indiscriminate act of mob violence, Gene Kellaway in The History of Torture and Execution, that's the book, History of Torture and Execution, says this regarding stoning in ancient Israel. Luke, to your point, quote, there's a danger in viewing historic laws with modern attitudes, heightened by the risk of mistranslation and misinterpretation. In defense of ancient Israel's laws, it should be stressed that the courts demanded overwhelming levels of proof before pronouncing the death penalty.
Not something we have today.
No.
Overwhelming evidence and overwhelming proof. No.
We need overwhelming press attention and media attention. That's what we need for conviction.
Yeah.
Conviction.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to continue with that again, I think underneath this, at least one of the things underneath this, is the idea of executions at all. That's not touched on, and that needs to be an argument that's had, a discussion that's had. Should, I mean, as you said, everybody believes in capital punishment. We're either going to execute the murderers, the people that deserve to be executed according to God's law, or we're going to execute victims like babies in the womb. So it's one or the other, and every single person that opposes this, that opposes capital punishment for biblical crimes of capital nature and supports abortion is a hypocrite for saying, oh, you guys want to put people to death. How horrible. Well, you do too. You just want to do it without a trial.
Yes.
So any execution is going to be shocking. I mean, do these people, are these people,
as it should be,
right? Are these people like, oh, you guys want to stone people, the electric chair or lethal injection? That's the one I really like. Like, is that how they're viewing this? Any execution is going to be shocking. It's going to be startling, as it should be. And the issue with stoning, and Luke, you've told me, look, if someone wants to present another option, we're all ears.
Yeah. I would actually say saline injections are more horrendous than stoning.
Okay.
Burning an infant in the womb.
Yes.
Have you ever seen some of those photos?
Yes.
I saw Silent Scream. I don't know if you've ever seen that or
I
not.
haven't, no.
That is that is not saline. I forget. I can't ever pronounce the name of the machine, but it's basically a knife with a vacuum, is what it is. And in Silent Scream, put together by Dr. Bernard Nathanson, this is years ago now. It's what do you call it when you take a picture inside the womb? What do you call
sonogram?
That? It's a sonogram
Or ultrasound.
ultrasound. But not sonogram.
Sorry.
Oh, that's sorry. Ultrasound, right? And it's a baby. It's a little baby girl. She's sucking her thumb. She's quiet, and all of a sudden that knife enters the womb, and she just reacts like this. And not to get too graphic, it's a lot more graphic to see it. But I mean, her little arms and legs go to war against that machine. It's horrible because you're watching a murder happening.
Yes.
Which Rolling Stone approves of.
Yes.
Well, Tim Dickinson in the article says that they, referring to Luke and myself, seek to jettison our constitutional system of checks and balances in favor of a government based on biblical law, including reviving punishments that clash violently, listen to this, with modern notions of human rights. Well, you've just heard a modern notion of human rights, and that is going into the womb and ripping apart a baby. So if does our position clash violently with that? Absolutely, because we do not believe that people should be executed without a trial, without evidence. So this needs to be pushed, and for any Christians listening, do not give ground to the pagans who critique and attack God's law and then in the next breath promote the murder of babies with no trial, who've never done any wrong, never been convicted of a crime. Do we believe that biblical law calls for the execution in some cases of people who've committed capital offenses? Yes, and we're not going to be ashamed of that. You should be ashamed of what you're promoting, which is the wholesale slaughter of babies, not to mention the butchering of trans kids, quote unquote, in the name of transgenderism. So there's just a lot of hypocrisy there.
Chris, that's what I was going to point out. I'm like, they should be ashamed of their hypocrisy more than they're not.
Yeah, and to that point, you're either going to convict the guilty or you're going to convict the innocent. And when you do it without a trial, now you're convicting the innocent, which is what, again, pagan jurisprudence calls for. Convict the innocent while pardoning the guilty. Completely opposite of what God says, which is why then God talks about, in his word, about innocent blood polluting the land. There's a pollution to really talk about right there. The pollution of innocent blood. What a wonderful God who's written us a wonderful book and his wonderful law, who will not wink at innocent blood. He has a problem with it, and he's going to solve it. What a wonderful law we have in the Word of God.
Yes. A couple of things, too, I wanted to mention that. He didn't watch the full podcast. I mean, I think someone just showed him a clip because, there's a section in there where we don't say anything nice about Christian nationalism. I don't know if you remember that part, but I trash the modern iteration of Christian nationalism, although some parts I agree with, but I trash it pretty well in that podcast. I'm frustrated with Christian nationalism. I don't think it... I think it wants a lot of them they want theonomy. with statism. And that's my frustration with Christian nationalism. And then he still calls us Christian nationalists. I'm like, well, how did you get that out of that podcast? Well, it's because you just fast forwarded to the part where the sensationalism. But I'm not a Christian nationalist in the sense that most people use it. I mean, again, I have a lot of frustrations with Christian. I don't identify myself with Christian nationalism. The only Christian nationalism I agree with is from Deuteronomy 4, where Moses said, the nations will look upon you and say, what a wise and understanding nation who has a God like this with laws like these. That to me is Christian nationalism, but you don't get that without theonomy and theocracy. It's just not going to happen. And the other thing is, Saint is an extremist, but he's not a nobody, and he's not alone. As you can see, we've doubled our numbers. Definitely not alone.
Next time we need to bring in some of our black friends because they're going to critique that there are 4 white guys here.
Yeah, I know. We've
What didn't it say? It didn't start out saying there's two. It veered. What'd the article say?
Yeah, starts off with 2 white dudes.
Two white dudes, and then it veered into crazy language.
Yeah, it says the podcast
without guardrails.
The podcast setup at first appears familiar. A pair of white dudes mic'd up at a table. I was going to say the article opening appears familiar. A white guy critiquing white guys for being white. Sorry, Luke. You were saying about...
Yeah, I was saying about the like they want to replace the Constitution. It's not that I want to replace the Constitution. I don't think anyone here wants to replace the Constitution. We love the Constitution, but we recognize... speaking for myself, I don't want to speak for anyone here, but for myself, I recognize the limitations and compared to God's law, which is perfect. Psalm 19 says the law of the Lord is perfect. But I don't have any scripture saying that the Constitution is perfect. And I know that someday it's going to fade away. It's going to become a museum piece. We're going to look at it and say, oh, I guess that's how they used to do government back then. Just like a lot of the other documents.
Roman Empire.
Just like the Roman Empire. Oh yeah, I guess that's how they did it.
Just like every other nation.
Yeah, just like every other nation. So, I believe in some aspects of American exceptionalism, but I don't believe in American perpetualism. It's always going to be here. I believe it's going to fracture. It's going to balkanize. That's what I personally believe. But the purpose of my book is, when we're presented with an opportunity, and I'm viewing this in the context of the meek shall inherit the earth. Someday we're going to be presented with an opportunity to start a new government because any nation that turns away from God will be destroyed, and a new nation will be put in its place. So what are we going to do? Are we going to try to go back to our statism, or are we going to try to go back to God's law? We have to move forward. We can't go back.
Well, speaking of going back, Luke, there's something I do want to go back to, and that is the impersonalness, if I can say that word, of putting people to death in our present system. Okay, we heard the testimony, yeah, put that person to death, and then I go home. There's a man named John Noble who wrote a book years ago called "I Was a Slave in Russia." And he talked about the impersonal nature. He saw people being dragged off to be executed, and he said it was super impersonal. He said it was almost as if they come and say, you know what, hey, it's time for your execution. Hey, can I have your clothes? Can I have your books? This kind of stuff. Nothing personal, comrade. We make mistakes all the time. Maybe this is a mistake. Hey, don't get mad at me. Right? To me, that is the end of status. Absolutely. That's the end of statism. Hey, you know what? You need to go for the good of the state. Mm-hmm. It's not that you actually committed a crime against your neighbor. For the good of the state, comrade, off to death with you.
2 things. Actually, 1 thing. How many times does the Bible actually record a stoning? I mean, as Stephen, but that was unjust.
That was unjust.
I think
we
it's
have
in
Achan, which was just.
No.
Stone of Achan.
Was it a stone? I thought they were consumed.
No, not Achan.
Okay, not Achan.
Yeah.
But there was the stoning of the blasphemer, the Egyptian blasphemer. I think that's in Numbers.
So 2 times?
Yeah, 2 or 3 times. There was the unjust stoning of Naboth.
Which was unjust.
So unjust, but so there's 2 unjust and 2 just.
Yeah. Yep.
So in the entire history of the Bible.
Yeah.
In the entire history from Genesis to Revelation, we have 4 instances: 2 just and 2 unjust.
That I can think of right now. Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And guys like Tim Dickinson are saying that we want to drag him out into the streets and stone him.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Like, does he even know how silly he sounds?
Right.
Seriously.
Right. Right.
I doubt it.
Well, but
I doubt he knows. In other words, I mean, it's really frustrating to see that kind of thing going out. But again, this is years and years of government schooling.
Yes.
So what are we to expect?
Yeah.
Here's the stoning. You got Stephen, you got Paul. He was stoned. He
was
didn't die
stoned.
though.
He
You got
didn't die.
Naboth. So those 3 unjust. Adoniram, the man King Rehoboam put in charge of forced labor. Zechariah the priest for prophesying against those breaking the commandments. Another unjust. Achan. And Shelomith's son, a man who blasphemed,
Yes.
and then the Sabbath issue, which they went to the Lord directly for the Sabbath breaking. So
Yes.
so there was 3 for blasphemy. Really?
no, one there was one for blasphemy,
Okay.
there was one for Sabbath violation, and there was Achan, and I think the other 5 were not just. So yeah, just got a few there.
Yeah.
So three just stonings in the Bible, and
One.
they're going to try to portray us
5
as
unjust.
as people who.
Yeah, and Steve Halbrook points out in his book, God is Just, that stoning was not exclusive to Israel. There were other nations that participated in that. So in Greece, for example, it was done in Greece, he points out. And, we praise Greece, right? What is it? The grandeur that was Greece, the glory that was Rome or whatever, right? What great civilization, all these cool statues of naked people.
Yeah.
Let's bring that back, right? But they stoned also. But I don't think anybody's going to have a problem with that because it was Greece and not Israel.
You know, we don't need to go down this rabbit trail, Chris, so you can jettison it. But back, you talked, Joe, about the early years of America, how they used to have speedy trials. You know, it's something we don't have anymore. We don't have a speedy trial. Now it's drug out, 10 years sometimes because there's appeal after appeal after appeal.
It can be 10 years or longer.
But you've talked about speedy trials, and X happened. There was witnesses. He was incarcerated for 24 hours, and then they found a big old oak tree with some rope. But you've said, I think it was you, who they used to have a pastor that he would get his meal, he would get a Bible, and he had a choice to make.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that was done especially in the West, which is not where capital punishment existed there in the West for people that were obviously convicted. And that is something that in American jurisprudence is not given enough attention to. It's called the Wild West. How was it tamed within a generation or two? Now we have the wild inner city, and there's no taming of that in sight anywhere. But to your point, Dave, what it was yes, you had a preacher, and people mock this now, right? A preacher talking to a guy, oh, how foolish is that? We need to understand one thing. With a speedy trial and a set date of execution, you had one advantage the rest of us don't have.
You knew when you were going to die.
You knew the day of your death. And so a preacher would go to him and say, listen, here's the thing. We have tried to have you in our society. You're too much of a danger. We cannot love the rest of society and still have you around because you are going to damage people. You're going to kill people. That's what you've been doing. So we cannot adjudicate your case any longer. We are now going to send you to a judge who can definitely adjudicate your case. And I'm here to help you meet him because you're about to. That is loving to your point.
That's just.
That is justice. To your point earlier, Luke, mercy and justice at the same time.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you're being just to the victims.
Absolutely.
And you're being just to the
That's right.
murderer.
It's justice to the victim, and it's not as just, I don't think, as stoning is because you have the state involved in the execution, but it's still just. It's very just to all the people that he's going to harm if you let him keep running around. Justice and mercy at the same time. To your point, Luke, where do we get that outside of the scriptures? It's not there anywhere.
Can't have it.
A few more things here. We got a few more minutes. I just wanted to circle back around and talk about this one more time. The issue of abusing the system, right? There always will be people who want to abuse the system. This is one of the things with your book, The Sound Doctrine of Theocracy, that you lay out that if you have a biblical system, it's very hard to abuse it. Now it can happen, and that's, you mentioned bribes, and people can bribe, but it's very hard because there's so many safeguards built in. It's hard for us to understand that sometimes. But with this issue of capital punishment and execution, I was talking to someone about it, and they said, well, surely there'd be people who would throw the first stone just because they hate this person, even if they weren't actually guilty of a capital. Yeah, there'd be people like that. But I think there's a lot more. Well, one, you still have to get through the trial. You have to get all the evidence has to be there as well. So it's not like someone that just says, "Oh, I hate this person, I want to stone them." They can
has
do
to be
it.
2 or 3 people actually seeing something. It's
right.
something called a trial.
And then the judges, that's where the civil government, the civil magistrates play a role as well. So again, we've covered that. It's not anarchy, but so there's always there's opportunities for people to have hate in their hearts and just want to wrongfully kill someone.
Yes.
But if you have a system where people's consciences are at peace with impersonal killing, that's far more dangerous.
Yes.
Because are there people today that would kill someone? Yeah, those are the murderers. Those are the people that should be executed. Yeah. But even by God's common grace, those people are few and far between. Even as far as with abortion, that's changing, and people are promoting it. But generally speaking, a lot of people would not, out in the open, walk up to someone and murder them. There's a common grace there. There's something of a conscience there that prevents them from doing that. And even in cases where you have these people who have been paid off to, testify falsely against someone, their conscience nags them. And a lot of those guys then come back later and said, I lied about this, even though there was no penalty coming to them.
Right.
Biblically, if you are found to be intentionally falsely testifying against someone to the end that they would be punished, you'd have to bear that. We've covered that. But my point is, it's far more dangerous to create a system where people can, with a clean conscience, say, I'm killing this person. I have no idea why, but the state told me to, and the state is God, and I will do whatever they say. So again, Christians, do not give these pagans an inch. They're going to critique us, say, oh, you want this mob rule, you want this crazy chaos. No, paganism gives us that.
Yes.
Statism gives us that, where you have the God of the state saying, I told you to kill this person, no questions asked, do it. Right. And biblical law, is there still an opportunity for abuse? Of course, because we're sinners. But there are so many safeguards there that it prevents that. And the alternative is, searing the conscience of these executioners. And as you mentioned, the lawyers and the attorney. I'm trying to. Do you care if this guy is actually innocent or guilty? Your job is to find him guilty. And that's not, again, the whole lawyer class, we could talk about that. That's not a biblical idea, but I just want to hammer that point home. Anything anybody wants to add on that?
I'd like to add the two-tiered justice system. Theocracy or biblical law would eliminate that. Mm-hmm. We've had a two-tiered justice system since 1970. Babies being murdered in the womb. We have it today. Red flag laws. All these conservatives that are out there, this is, or even Christians who say this is a bad system that we're talking about. You need to do it behind closed doors. Well, we are, by the way. You can't. It would eliminate that two-tiered system that we have so prevalent in the United States.
Yeah, and what a lot of people, when I talk to them about this, a lot of the whatabouts. What about this or what about that? Aren't we going to get this and aren't we going to get that? The answer is usually, if we stop and think about it, we have that right now. People say, well, I was talking to a friend about this once, and he said, well, what about psychopaths who just want to stone everyone to death? Well, law is not really going to stop a psychopath. Psychos don't care about the law. They're going to manipulate, and they're going to kill people, whether it's legal or illegal.
Until they're executed.
Until they're executed, basically. What about psychopaths? Won't they just stone everyone? Well, what's to stop a psychopath from stoning someone to death right now? Come on, guys. Seriously, think about it. In this case, you'd have to get 2 or 3 psychopaths together. And right now, you can get 2 or 3 psychopaths together and you can accuse someone and they don't even need to see it all the way through. they can just basically frame someone. It's so easy to frame, and you can frame people with circumstantial evidence, and that's enough to put you away. No eyewitnesses, just circumstantial evidence.
And just the accusation is not enough in and of itself. There needs to be 2 or 3 witnesses, but we're not saying that's all you need.
Right.
There still needs to be evidence then, and the judges consider that.
There needs to be something magical called a trial.
Right.
That's this magical, wonderful thing with somebody called a judge who has to adjudicate. All the what about this or what about that? Usually when people say, well, what about this, what about that? The answer is, friend, if you stop to think about it, we have that right now, and it's much worse. And for a lot of Christians listening to this and saying, oh, this is crazy, this is ridiculous. I was listening to Doug Wilson teach just yesterday, and he was saying, if you read the book of Judges, everything's going well, and then you turn the page and they're back into corruption. And then they kind of reform or they revive, and then you turn the page and they're back into corruption. One thing he didn't say, and I bring this up, this is a big point in my book, is that it's easy to miss the small phrase, the land had rest. That's the only time in Israel's history, with the exception of one other time, that the phrase the land had rest is used. They had 80 years, they had 40 years, and then 40 years, and then, they had 40 years, and then 80 years, and then 40 years, and then 40 years. That's 200 years of rest. America has not even come close to that kind of track record. We can't even touch that. The land had rest for 80 years. Can you imagine 80 years? But I thought everyone was in the street stoning each other. How could the land have rest if we're all in the street stoning each other to death? God didn't institute anarchy and chaos. You don't know what justice is apart from God's law. You don't know what it is. And even as wicked, that to me is a testament to the effectiveness of God's law, because we looked at judges and look how crazy everybody was. Even with how crazy they were, how did they get 80 years of peace? Even with how crazy they were. Most people say they're crazier than us, right? But how did they get 80 years of rest and we can't even touch that? Why? God's law is just. It's called the law of liberty. God's law does not institute injustice. Only man can institute injustice. That's one of the points of my book, and that's why I wrote the book. We got to get our statism out of our heads and look to God's law and believe what the Bible has to say about God's law, that it is perfect. Christian, do you believe that? Do you believe it? Do you live it? That's my challenge to you. Do you believe the claims of Scripture that it please God to magnify His law and make it glorious, that the coastlands wait for His law, as you said yesterday, Chris? Do we really believe that? Or we're just like, it was a bad idea then, it's a bad idea now. And that's the attitude of most Christians.
Well, most Christians, it was even in the comments, I think, and whether it was a Christian that commented, but, the law was for the Jews. We have the New Testament. That's the mentality everyone's got.
Right.
And most Christians that are listening are probably going to be like, well, these guys are crazy because the law's for the Jews and we have the New Testament.
Yeah,
because that mentality has permeated our culture.
Yes.
Joel, anything you want to add on that? I want to bring up a couple more things here. We've talked about that before on the show, about the law of God and the goodness of it. You have 1 Timothy 1, where Paul says the law is, and that actually leads us into my next point. So maybe we can tie it together here, that the law is laid down for the unrighteous. If you have a righteous people, don't need the law in that sense, right? Like the law against adultery. The law of God's written on my heart as a believer. The state's not going to need to come in and deal with that issue for me, right? If I'm being faithful to Christ. But if you have a society that's given over to sin, that the law restrains that. Now, let me have you comment on that first. Just the idea that the law is for the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's no law there, and then we'll get into this other idea of the meek inheriting the earth that Luke brought up.
Yeah, well, we've been talking here about Christians and their opposition to professing Christians and their opposition to the law, the wonderful law of God, despite what the New Testament there in 1 Timothy and Paul, who says he delights in the law of God. Paul literally saying, I delight in theonomy, right? Theonomy, God's law. Paul says he delights in that. Now, there's a lot to explore there. To your point, Chris, I want to address what was being done even in the Old Testament, because we think, wow, we're against the God's law in the New, because we have the New Testament now we're against it. No, Jeremiah had the same problem. He had the problem of people being against God's law. Covenant people of Israel, of Judah in this case, who hated God's law. back then. And it didn't go well for them back then. The word came to Jeremiah from the Lord saying, this is Jeremiah 7, and I want to make a point about statism here. And this is what the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. It said, stand in the gate of the Lord's house, so go down to the temple. In this case, not the king, the temple, because these people need to hear what you have to say. And what's he saying?
Go down to a local church.
Exactly. Okay. And proclaim there this word and say, hear the word of the Lord, all ye of Judah that enter in at these gates to worship the Lord. So they're doing the right thing. How can you argue with this? We're going to the temple to worship the Lord. What's this Jeremiah guy doing here, right? Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and I will cause you to dwell in this place. Amend your ways. Amend what you're doing. Not your, not necessarily your, the order of your service or how long you do worship songs or whatever. Amend what you do. Trust ye not in lying words, saying the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. In other words, we're okay because we're in a nice temple here, so we must be okay.
We're at church. We're at church.
Yep, we're okay. That's right. That's right. I'm in church. What else do you want? Here's the key verse right here. For if ye thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if ye thoroughly execute judgment between a man and his neighbor. Judgment between a man and his neighbor. I want to emphasize this because the way with our statist mentality, what we've been talking about here, it's not between a man and his neighbor, it's between a man and the state.
Yeah.
And that is, we have just, I know the point's been made, we've just got to get that out of our heads. You know, we do that in our trials now. You know, so-and-so versus the state of Pennsylvania or whatever. We do that all the time.
Yes.
That's not justice. Justice is between a man and his neighbor here. The state is not involved except to enforce that justice.
To adjudicate it.
That's exactly right. We saw the same thing back in Exodus where Jethro, where he's talking to Moses, and he says to Moses, you judge between one and another. Not between you know, somebody says something bad about you, Moses. No. Between disputes between one and another. I pray by the grace of God that everyone who names the name of Christ, who loves his neighbor, will understand that justice is between a man and his neighbor and not between a man and the state.
Amen.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Paul saying he delights in the law. And by the way, Paul, when he was on trial at one point in the book of Acts, he says, if I have done anything worthy of death, I do not object to being executed, basically. Right? And I was reading John in the past couple of days as well, and at several points, the Jews take up stones to stone Jesus. And he doesn't say, whoa, I don't believe in stoning. He says, okay, what have I done worthy of this? So
interesting. Yeah.
You have those cases now. And then also we talked about the one case of stoning, and you just mentioned Jeremiah. Zechariah the priest, he was stoned to death unjustly, and the reason was, same thing as Jeremiah, he was calling people to follow God's law. It says here in, this is 2 Chronicles, the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah the son of Jehoiada the priest, who stood above the people and said to them, thus says God, why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he also has forsaken you. So they conspired against him, and at the command of the king, they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. So there you have an apostate king. The king is the one who's saying, okay, stone this guy.
So all was needed was the command of the king, right? That was it.
Right.
Oh, man, what does that sound like?
So Zechariah says, you've broken God's law, you can't prosper. I want to use that as a segue here to this idea that you brought up, the meek will inherit the earth, and the impact of adultery, of the shedding of innocent blood, of any number of sins. What is that going to lead to for a society? It's going to destroy that nation. And so that leads us into what you said, and also what we're proposing here. We're not proposing, okay, we get a small group of Christians together and we go out there and we take over the government. Like, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that when you reject God and his law, your society will be destroyed.
Yes,
and that's kind of the point of your whole book, okay?
Yeah.
When that happens, and it will happen.
Yes.
If America does not repent, we will be like the Roman Empire. We will be overrun, and then from those ashes, hopefully a Christian society will be built up. So any comments on that, just to make it crystal clear? One, the impact of rejecting God's law, and two, what we're saying is, hey, once people come to realize that, they will want God's law, right? It's not going to need to be this top-down thing where it's like, oh, there's this tiny group of people that think, people shouldn't be murdered and there shouldn't be adultery. No, the hearts are going to be changed. And then the law of God is a protection on that society. I mean, you two are going to Africa here in a week or so, right? And we've talked about Uganda before on this podcast. And that's an example. And you're going to another country in Africa that you've told me that there seems to be some stirring there that they want something of a Christian nation. And the idea, especially with the Uganda thing, and is there stuff wrong there? Are there bad motives with some people? Maybe. But what they're overall, the big picture is they're saying, look, we need to protect our society from sodomy, from transgenderism, because if we don't, it will destroy our society. And so that's not, people in Uganda, it's not like, oh, we have this tiny group of Christians that are forcing this on us. The people overwhelmingly support that measure.
Yeah. I'm laughing at this idea of how democracy saves us, right? But then, except in Uganda, when they democratically do not want to countenance sodomy, right? Now democracy is suddenly a problem. It's no wonder that Christ spent so much time on hypocrisy. He spends all of Matthew 23 on it. You hypocrites, and when we accept hypocrisy, which is what frankly, this our article has done, saying two things actually in the same time. These Christian nationalists want to stone everybody's lights out, right? And then quoting you accurately saying, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want the occasion for it. We'd be thrilled if there was never, again, as long as we all shall live, another occasion to execute anybody. That would be a wonderful thing. But the hypocrisy is just everywhere, which you have to have. Let's not forget this. You have to have hypocrisy once you denigrate, once you oppose, once you abandon the law of God. Because the law of God is consistent, it's perfect. Everything else is going to be imperfect. It's going to be flawed. And so if you embrace any other law or any other code, if you will, you're going to be embracing hypocrisy. I want to make one other point too, because somebody's going to get excited about, well, there was stoning for blasphemy. This actually, in that instance, it's an instance of the protection of God's law. I'm going to tell you why. Because they had they had Moses right there. This man obviously blasphemed God, which was you can't the blasphemy that goes on. God is actually the lawgiver, and once you blaspheme the lawgiver, you're ultimately going to abandon the law. Now, in this case, they had Moses, the lawgiver, right with them. They did not even have the confidence to go out and stone him. They had to go to God directly, and God had to speak to that because they were that reticent. They were that slow, if you will, just to pick up stones and stone people. So even in that particular case, we see the protection that the law provided, even a blasphemer in that case.
Two things. Blasphemy. We have blasphemy today against the state.
Do we ever?
That's true.
Like we have it all. We have people prosecuted all the time.
Yeah. Or say the N word.
Yeah.
And you're
That's
done.
blasphemy.
That's blasphemy.
Whatever.
I mean, you're finished.
But yeah, you're done. Two things. One for the Christian, or that was one of them. The second one is for the Christian out there. The Christian who says that the law is for the Jews, that we are no longer under the law. What are you going to do? I would invite you onto this podcast to argue your ideas of when Christ talks about putting a millstone around someone's neck.
Yeah.
When Christ talks about someone who
Curses their father
and mother.
Yeah.
Matthew 15. Yep.
What are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
Because you have better wrestle with that.
Yeah.
You know, I some people say, "Well, you guys have these lofty ideas. You guys always, you're obviously thinking about this stuff 24/7." No, we're not. We have other things that we do. The thing is, those people who say the Bible is inconsistent, let's at least get the parts together that are consistent.
Yeah.
That's my thing for the Christian.
I just want to point out, the instances you brought up of stoning, and a lot of people can say, well, see, look at that. See, it was abused more often than it was used. All of the times that it was used properly was under a theocratic system, and all the times it was abused was when they rejected that theocratic system. There was statism or rabbinical Phariseeism. They had rejected God's theocratic system,
Right.
And that's when the abuse started happening. And again, that goes back to the point that when they tried to use pure theonomy to prosecute Christ, they couldn't do it. The most innocent victim was able to walk in freedom in his own law because it's his character and nature. That they tried to use it with pure theonomy to prosecute Christ, but they couldn't do it, and they even tried to abuse it because they tried to bring in false witnesses, but it didn't work. So they had to outsource it to statism to kill Christ. Christ was a victim of statism, in his death. That again is something that's noteworthy in the application of God's law, that they could not use God's law to kill Christ. They had to use the state.
Yeah, that's a great point. And all those cases of just executions none of them were under the kings, like you said.
You're right.
They were all under Moses or Joshua, and then you had the judges. Of course, those cases of unjust executions were under apostate kings.
Right.
Naboth and 1 Kings, of course, Ahab and Jezebel, Zechariah we just read. And then you have 1 Kings, the drama, drama with King Rehoboam, tyrannizing the people, and then I think the people may have rised up against him. So, all right, we still have a few more minutes here. Anything, Luke, you want to add to this idea of? Well, actually, let me go to you first, Joel. The destruction of society via immorality, via adultery, via the shedding of innocent blood. And you can comment as well, Luke. I mean, you've mentioned how, and this was one of the things that was actually quoted in the article, that the sin of adultery is far worse than stoning. Of course, just stoning is not a sin, but adultery is far worse than stoning. And so, Joel, first to you, just the destruction and chaos that comes when you abandon God's law, even in the case of marriage.
Yeah, sure enough. God is the one who has created marriage, as we pointed out before. It was his idea. One of the great, I believe, proofs that the Bible is divinely inspired, because the Bible definitely promotes one man, one woman, and no man, if left to himself. If the Bible is written by men, it would actually write anything like that. In fact, we see other. This article here by Tim Dickinson, written by man. Right? He didn't have a problem with adultery. I'm sure he wouldn't have a problem at all with multiple wives, if he even believes in marriage at all. Multiple girlfriends or whatever you want to have.
You got to defend him a little bit. He could have been much harder. He could have twisted things much more, Joel.
Well, but I'm not going to defend him because he could have been worse. Thanks a lot. What a guy. You weren't horrible. That's our new standard now, right? You didn't completely slander. Oh, yeah. Please, let's have coffee. But
Love to.
Yeah, we have invited Tim in, and we're dealing with his argument, his worldview here, which is what he wanted to do. And so
we're doing. But yeah, great point though, Dave. But adultery. Where have, and I'm gonna get off of Tim here for a minute and talk about the Church of Jesus Christ, the church, which has backed off adultery completely. Why do we have this abortion problem? Is it not because when it comes to adultery and fornication, we don't have anything to say about that anymore? No wonder the Rolling Stones of the world don't have a problem with it. The Church of Jesus Christ doesn't seem to have a problem with it. And anytime you get adultery and fornication, you are going to want to get rid of the natural results of that adultery and fornication, and that's to kill the child, and that is why we have so much innocent blood going on here. I maintain, Chris, that if the Church of Jesus Christ would have been as hard on adultery as the Scriptures are, we wouldn't be having this innocent blood. But once we embrace an idea that God's law is useless, and it doesn't really speak to these points about adultery and fornication and so forth, innocent blood is the very next thing. I know I've mentioned this before in this podcast. When you watch those, and it's an amazing thing to me. I know I get it that we have YouTube now, and we have more access to these murder shows, but on YouTube there are more murder shows than I know possibly, and people just telling stories about murder. I mean, they're everywhere. I can't believe how many of them there are. And in almost every case, there's a few cases where it doesn't happen, but in almost every case, there's adultery, there's fornication, there's so-called cheating going on. So we're not just talking about the death, and if you love life, you're going to hate fornication and adultery. And I do mean hate, because in these shows, you see adultery, fornication, and you see death, not just of the baby, but of a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a jealous person here, a jealous person there. You see it everywhere. And yeah, to your point, Chris, you cannot love life and not hate adultery and fornication at the same time. And if you love adultery and fornication, then you hate life.
Joe, you said the church. I think I saw a statistic once where it was like 1 in 4 women in the church, 1 out of every 4 women in your congregation have had an abortion.
Well, I mean I don't know if that's a high number or low number, but I recently had a discussion with some people who were talking about this. I'll just say it that way, and I was pointing out to them, when you do abortion work, you'd be surprised how many nice little Christian bumper stickers you see pulling into that abortion clinic. You will see it if you're out there long enough. You'll see it.
Yeah, and I don't know.
There.
Tim might go to church. I'm not. I mean, maybe he does, but at the same time, that is the problem. Ultimately,
Rolling Stones in New York, right? Maybe attends Tim Keller's church. Just kidding.
No, I don't think he's from New York. I think he's from Seattle.
I'm not sure where he's from.
Yeah, I think he resides.
Okay.
I'm not sure either.
But again, I do thank Tim for doing the article. I understand where he's coming from. He labels us extremists. I would do the same to him, because when you abandon God's law, that's extreme, and you want to put humanism in its place. But I appreciate him, doing the article, and we would love to have him in. We'd love to have anybody from Rolling Stone join us. And Tim said that one of his questions was, you think the Bible can give us a just society, or can more of a just society than the current American system? Like, yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
And any Christian who doesn't think that, I think has been influenced by this statism, and we would love to have that discussion, because let's compare biblical justice with 60 million babies butchered, kids having their genitals sliced off. Let's do it. Defend it.
Yeah.
You won't defend it. And every time I ask people that question, okay, so you're okay with the babies being slaughtered behind closed doors. You don't want a trial. There's crickets in response, because they can't answer it.
Yeah. One other thing is, for the Christian out there, is as long as you are going to support public education, you will find theonomy or biblical law abhorrent to you. You will. There's simply, if you just think of this, Christian, you send your children to public education, which is a humanistic system. You send them there to be indoctrinated. Would you do that to a Muslim school? Would you do that to a Buddhist school, a Hindu school? Would you do that? No. Most of them would be absolutely appalled.
Oh yeah. No, I would never do that.
I would never do that.
No, I'm a Christian.
So I guess my point is, as long as you send them to a public school where they're being indoctrinated with humanism,
Yes.
you will have a problem with God's law.
Yes, you will. Amen to that.
You will, because you will not be able to justify rising up and lying down. And I'm not saying you have to homeschool your children.
Right.
You can send them to a private school.
Right.
But you will have a problem with God's law.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Yes.
And I mean, and how many Christians are there like that? I mean, there's thousands, probably tens of thousands here in Lancaster County.
Right.
And so they will have a problem with what we're saying this morning, strictly because of that.
Right.
Yeah, well, I've talked to someone actually years ago who said he would send them there, and that's actually consistent. If you would send your kids to humanist school, send them to a Muslim school. But this is actually my topic at the upcoming conference, so I can't give away too much. But but the idea is, we have that mindset is very much a retreatist mindset. It's saying, Christianity and the gospel is not going to take over the educational realm. So my only concern is, well, what can I do with the scraps here instead of taking back education? But great points. Yeah, as long as you're being taught by the state, they're going to hate Christ, and that we talked about last. We don't have time to get into it.
But I'm just talking to the parents, even.
Oh, right.
I'm talking to the parents are not going to embrace biblical law, because it will accuse them.
Yeah, it's a standing indictment.
Yeah, this is serious business, because God says clearly, if you have a problem with my law, I have a problem with you. Whoever, therefore, breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever doesn't teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. You have a problem with God's law? Mom, Dad, God has a problem with you.
I'm just saying. I mean, that's ultimately where we're at.
Yeah. I want to bring up just 2 passages real quick, Chris, if we have time.
Yep.
But for again, this is a podcast mostly for Christians, because the pagans naturally hate God's law, but there's hope for Christians to to turn around their thinking and reform their thinking, because so that's our motto: think and reform at the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society. I'm going to bring out two passages that put the law and the gospel right next to each other and show that they're not at odds with each other. The first one is Romans chapter 1, where Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel." And it's the power of God and salvation. A lot of Christians like to quote that, but what they don't like to quote is later down in the same chapter. He says, "Those who they not only know that those who practice such things deserve to die." Okay. Now, then for most Christians, when they read that, they put their statism in there and they think about, witch hunts and jackboots. No, the only way to get rid of witch hunts and jackboots is theocracy. You're always going to, because we have it right now. We have witch hunts, we have jackboots right now in our statism. They want more of that. The only way to get rid of witch hunts and jackboots is to implement theocracy, because theocracy cannot institute injustice. The other passage I want to read, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8. We know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and godless, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for sexually immoral persons, for homosexuals, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching, according to the gospel of the glory of the blessed God, which I have been entrusted. So there it is. Friends, it's not like now that we have the gospel, we can get rid of the law. The law is not good for our justification. We are justified by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, by his blessing, by his work on the cross. That's how we're justified. However, that does not mean that the law is now therefore completely inapplicable. The law still applies in its application. We now love the law because the Spirit is within us. The Spirit doesn't hate the law. God doesn't hate his own nature. So you have to develop a love for the law that after reading the scriptures, you must harmonize the scriptures with your attitude of the law. Or I should say, you must harmonize your attitude of the law with the attitude of the scriptures. If you read through Psalm 119 and you read his attitude towards the law, and that does not describe you, you're doing something way wrong with your life.
Amen. Well, I want to read one quote here, and then we'll go around. Final word from all you gentlemen, if you have something, and then we'll wrap up here. So I want to read this quote from Greg Bonson talking about capital punishment. And he says, "The application of capital punishment to appropriate criminals contributes to the expiration of evil and produces reverence for God's righteousness. It demonstrates and preserves the sanctity of life, truth, family, sex, property, and authority. It is not without significance that the major problems facing society today are listed among those things which God adjudges to be things worthy of capital punishment." And I think it was Rushdoony who said, if it wasn't Bonson, that if a society won't deal with these sins, and then God will deal with that society, and he'll bring the death penalty on that society. And that is what we are seeing today. So we'll start over here with Joel. Anything that we didn't cover? We got about 5 minutes left, so you got 1 minute.
I'll make it quick. From Deuteronomy 17:7, when you hear, back up a little bit, when you hear statists talk, well, we're always going to have these problems, we're always going to have this, we're always going to have the murderers and so forth. Actually, not true. Again, God's law, Deuteronomy 17:7, the hands of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all the people. So you shall put away the evil from among you. Think about that. Moses sees through the application of God's law, not the complete eradication of evil, of course, but in terms of an evil society and injustice, Moses sees the possibility of putting away evil from a society. You mean a woman could walk down a dark street alone? Yeah. You mean you could go to Central Park at night and not feel threatened? Yes. God's law. You're not going to get it any other way. And to oppose God's law is to embrace fear and murder.
Luke?
Yeah. One of the things I say about statism is that you basically, statism, one of the parts of the nature of statism is that when you give your life to the state, you give up all your freedom, but they give you one thing in return, and that is your desire to do whatever sin you want to do that you exchange for your freedom. That's one of the that's part of the nature of statism. Yes, you can do this sin. You came to me and asked me, can I do this sin? And we're going to say yes, but here's the thing, you owe me your life now. And Christ's claim is that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And that also applies to the law. The law of God is referred to in James as the law of liberty. The state cannot make that claim. And I think it's Job 29. But Job makes a lot of claims about what he did for the widow and the orphan. And people will say, "Well, I'm not religious. I'm just spiritual." But James says true religion is this: visiting the widows and orphans in their affliction. And I'm paraphrasing there. But if you look at what Job was doing under the theocratic system, who does Job say that he was ministering to? The widow and the orphan. If we reject God's system, the widow and the orphan will also be rejected. The best way to minister to the widow and the orphan is to implement theocratic, theonomic system to push society towards not God's law and not away from it. Otherwise, we'll never be able to institute true religion.
Dave?
To Tim Dickinson and those at the Rolling Stone and anyone else who would oppose it, rather than spewing all your stuff on the internet, we would love to have you in. We would love to have dialogues. We understand it's easier to throw some words up on a comment section, but at the end of the day, the hypocrisy shines through bright and clear. Those of you who are opposed to this idea, we need to have these conversations. I do hope that I live to see a just society. I hope Tim Dickinson lives to see a just society. I think most people think that everyone has to be Christian for this. No, not everyone's Christian. So even if you don't believe in God, hopefully you'll live to see a just society like this. And then to the Christian, you seriously need to think where you stand in terms of God's law word. You need to think about what you're doing with your children. You need to think about public school. You need to think about all of these issues when it comes to a humanist society that we live in. And to the state and anyone who may be watching this, we need to, we need to, and I'm talking Lancaster County, we need to consider justice in these issues. And if we can we at least start looking at this and having open debates?
Repent and believe the gospel, Lancaster.
Amen.
Everyone.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are out of time. I want to thank each one of you for coming in, and I want to remind everybody to go to futureofchristendom.org, the conference that Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society is putting on. Again, Luke's the chairman. Joel is the executive director. That conference is coming up in September. Again, thanks to Tim for bringing a little more attention to that conference. It's going to be an exciting one, I think. There's going to be a debate with Dr. James White. Joel, you'll be speaking. Luke, you're not on the schedule, but I'm hoping you'll find a way somehow to get in there. And to say, go to futureofchristendom.org. Let me end with these words from Job that you referenced, Luke. Because I delivered the poor who cried out, the fatherless and the one who had no helper. The blessing of a perishing man came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. That's a just civil ruler there. So for more information about the Lancaster Patriot, go to thelancasterpatriot.com. Until next time, remember, Christ, not the state, is king.